Hey there, my gardening friends. I hope this video finds you well. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever thought to yourself, I want to start a garden, but I'm not sure exactly where to begin? Or perhaps you're a seasoned grower, yet you have questions about a specific plant. If the answer to either one of those questions is yes, then guess what? You're in the right space. Hi, my name's Graylen Brown. I am a inactive Texas master gardener, former educator, an automotive technician with over 2 decades of dirt under the nails experience in growing plants out here in North Texas. My goal is to become your trusted source for all things gardening. So, for our first episode, let's go ahead and do, let's say, a crash course. And we're going to talk about how to start a garden for the first time. So, with that being said, we're going to be talking about our goals. We're going to be talking about our budget. And then we're going to talk about 3 different growing techniques that I think will lend itself well to a beginner gardener. So, with that being said, let's jump right in to some gardening. So, before we get into the whole knit and grit, so to speak, of gardening, I propose yet another question for you. What is your why? What's the reason? Why are you choosing gardening? And I really want you to think about that because in a project-based learning environment, which gardening 100% is a project-based learning environment, you always want to have the end result in mind. Because trust me, in gardening, there will be things that will present a plethora of challenges for you. There'll be pests, there'll be disease, there'll be plants that will just outright and die. When those challenges present themselves and things get hard, you need to know why you're doing this in the first place. Whatever your why is, I need you to remember that. I need you to write it down, remember it, take a picture, etc. I don't know. But when times get hard, that's where you're going to need to go to that mental space so that you know that, hey, I'm doing this for a reason. Now that we have our goals in mind and we know what our end result is, we know why we want to garden. Now let's start looking at our budget because believe it or not, gardening can be very expensive if we allow it. But I'm not just talking about money. So, yes, you have money, but you also have your time and effort as well. That's your sliding scale right there. That's your trade off. How much money do I want to spend to minimize my time and effort? Case in point, I was actually speaking with a contractor several months ago, and he was telling me about a house he was contracted to work. And he said, when he found out that, I was into gardening and all that I do, he told me about a customer that had spent $35,000 on a new gardening build. Now, this was a new home that was being constructed, and the customer also wanted a garden. So they spent $35,000 on having the proper drainage, irrigation, raised beds, a walking path, trellises, and so forth. They wanted a ready to go garden that was just ready to assemble, ready to start growing and harvesting right from the gates. Now, of course, in this situation, they had the disposable income to do so. Now, by no means am I telling you to spend $35,000 on creating a garden, unless you want to and you have the disposable income. All I'm saying is keep that in mind because gardening can be very expensive if you allow it. So let's start with a budget and then go from there. All right, so now that we've discussed our goals, our budgets, and so forth, now let's consider location. Location is going to be very important, but location is also going to be heavily dependent upon what type of gardening you're going to be doing. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to recommend 3 gardening styles that I think will lend themselves very well to a beginner gardener. Now, of course, there are a plethora of styles that you can try from xeriscaping to aquaponics, hydroponics, chaos gardening, minimalist gardening, and so forth. But I'm only talk about 3 today because I don't want to overwhelm you. Because sometimes, truth be told, sometimes in gardening, we get so excited about growing our plants and seeing the results that we just want to do everything. We want to grow everything. We want to try everything. And there's nothing wrong with trying that, trying out those different styles and so forth. But let's baby step first. Let's start small and then grow from there. Pun totally intended. So, the three styles that I want to talk with you today about are styles that I believe lends themselves very well to beginner growers. And plus, they kind of really harness the whole principle of gardening and growing. First, being traditional row gardening, then container gardening, and then, of course, raised bed gardens. I'm going to break down the pros and cons that come with each, and you can use this information to make the determination on what's going to be best for your growing situation. Now, the first style that we're going to talk about is going to be our tried and our true, our tested, and that's our traditional row gardening. Traditional row gardening has the lowest overall upfront cost associated with it, outside of maybe like a minimalist gardening. Although it has the highest amount of effort and sweat equity requirements, this type of gardening is just as it sounds. You are tilling the soil to create rows in order to produce your plants. This is the image we envision when we think of the classic farmer cultivating rows to make their produce. This is a method has been around, like I said, for thousands of years and dates back to the earliest forms of civilization. All right, now, while traditional row gardening of all the methods that I'm going to discuss with you today is going to be the most cost effective as far as a monetary value is considered, there are things that you're going to need to consider. One, what's the fertility of your soil? Will you need to amend it? Also, will the location I choose for my garden get enough sun? Because one thing to factor in with traditional row gardening, it is very dependent upon space. Traditional row gardens requires large amounts of space. So this may not be feasible for someone living in limited space, living in an apartment or so forth, or if you're living like in an urban environment. Also, remember that no matter what style of garden you choose to embark upon, plants will always still need the same thing, and that's going to be your soil or your growing medium, water, and light. Now, before I mentioned soil fertility, but what's our soil consistency? If we're going to be putting down these traditional rows, is there heavy clay, soil, silt deposits, sand, and what have you? All of these factors can truly present challenges. Now, I'm not saying that these challenges can't be addressed and amended, but again, it's still going to cost you time, effort, and money. So these are factors that you need to consider if you're thinking about going traditional row style gardening. All right, and now the next style that I'm going to highly recommend is going to be container gardening. And container gardening is going to be really kind of like a go-to for a lot of beginner gardeners. Reason being is one, it's highly adaptable, it's versatile, you can mix and match, you're using containers. Another being that the fact that you won't have to bend and kneel as much depending on the size of your containers. It's very durable for people with less mobility, specifically with when you're working with children. But just like traditional row gardening, there are drawbacks to container gardening as well. First, being your initial upfront cost. You're going to need to purchase containers. Additionally, you're going to need to purchase your soil. Now, you can try to still use your native soil, but you're going to have to amend it because you're in a situation where you're using containers. So you have a higher probability of compacting that soil by placing it in a small or large size container. Also, since our soil and plants are going to be placed in containers, you're going to be limited by the size of said container. For instance, growing tomatoes, determinate tomatoes, which are your bush tomatoes, they're going to need at least a minimum of like a 10-gallon container. Now, if we're talking about like our indeterminate, that's going to be your vining type, your vining style tomatoes, they're going to need at least a minimum of a 15-gallon container. So, and don't worry, when we start talking about our different annuals and perennial plants and so forth, I'll tell you and give you the recommended size for each one. But just know that you are limited based on the size of your container, because any gardener will tell you that when we talk about plant growth, 50% of plant growth happens below the soil line. So when it comes to containers, you can be limited by that. Another factor to consider is that when we're talking about container gardening, there is going to be a more frequent need for watering, because since we're not in the traditional rows sitting down in the soil, that water is going to have to drain out. When it drains out, your soil has a higher probability of drying out sooner. Not to mention, in fluctuations with weather and temperature. Your soil is going to be more susceptible to the different changes in your microclimate. So just be sure to factor in both the pros and the cons when considering any style of gardening. But container gardening does have a lot of pros that might lend themselves well to someone who's starting a garden for the first time. Plus, the main selling feature when it comes to container gardening is that you are now no longer limited by the amount of available space. It's not like with traditional rows where you have to have large, massive amounts of space to grow your crops. You can truly mix and match, and you can plant on a patio, you can plant on a deck, and so forth. All right, now here are two pro tips when it comes to cost cutting measures. As far as your containers are concerned, sure, you can go out and buy expensive pots and containers and grow bags that will look great and look intentional. Or you can try repurposing containers that you may already have. There are a plethora of ideas out there that's at your disposal. It is only limited by your own imagination. I mean, I've grown things, you name it, 5-gallon buckets, canvas bags, small kiddie swimming pools, plastic totes, etc. Now, I will admit it won't look as attractive, but it will still get the job done. At the end of the day, you do what works best for you in your growing situation. Secondly, when it comes to purchasing your soil, I would recommend finding a local distributor. If you have access to a local landscaping company, and have access to a truck, you'll usually find that purchasing soil in bulk from a local supplier will be less expensive than buying soil from your big box stores and your garden centers. I mean, typically for a 2 cubic foot bag of potting soil or gardening soil, what have you. Well, in this situation, we're talking about containers. So we're definitely talking about a potting mix. You're probably looking at $8 to $10 a bag, and that can get really expensive really quickly. Additionally, the soil from your local supplier is going to be native soils, native to your growing zone. You can usually find differing soil blends ranging from sandy loam, gardening soil, potting mix, acidic blends, and so forth, not to mention compost and mulch. Now, one of the companies that I use out here in North Texas, I've been using for years, and it's honestly been like a secret weapon of mine, and that's Living Earth. Living Earth is a local supplier that is local to both Texas and Tennessee. And I usually amend my traditional rows, as well as my containers and raised beds, just about every spring growing season since I have been growing. And the products that they produce are organic, and they've been doing it since 1985. So Living Earth is definitely one of my go to companies. Now that we've talked about traditional row gardening and we've talked about container gardening, the third method I want to talk to you about is raised bed gardening. Of these three styles of gardening that I've mentioned before, raised bed gardening, in my opinion, is going to be the most aesthetically pleasing. Allows you to control more of the ease of access to your garden. Raised beds will allow you to control the drainage, weed suppression, and your gardening boundaries. It's ideal growing situations where soil may be poor, as stated when we talked about traditional row gardening. For instance, if you have heavy clay, you have heavy rock and sand and so forth. Just like previously mentioned in other gardening styles, there are downsides to this as well. First is going to be your upfront costs. Just like with container gardening, you will need to purchase or build your raised bed. And this will differ in price based off of several factors. Are you purchasing a prefabricated raised bed, or are you making it yourself? Or if you're purchasing a prefabricated raised bed, what are the materials it's being made from? While raised beds made from lumber may be lower in cost, it will deteriorate over time. Yes, even cedar. While lumber from cedar is rot resistant, it still will decay. Thus, eventually the raised bed will need to be repaired, costing both, again, time and money. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, there are metal raised beds, which last significantly longer, but the initial upfront cost may be a little daunting. All right, now by chance, if you are in the market for a prefabricated metal raised bed, then I have an affiliate that I want you to take a look at right
What
here.
I'm installing today is a 15-inch deep Birdie's raised bed from Epic Gardening. Now, whenever I'm installing a new raised bed, I always like to put down a layer of cardboard first. This aids in weed suppression, plus it's a good source of carbon as it breaks down. Next, I add in my sticks and then my compost bin as well. If you'd like to know more about the compost bin that I'm using, make sure to ask about it in the comments. And now I'm adding in my mulch. I'm adding a great deal of mulch because 1, it's an inexpensive filler as opposed to just using straight soil. 2, it'll help with moisture retention, and plus it'll break down over time, as well as it'll help stop soil compaction. And now it's time to add my soil layer, which is a mixture of Texas native soil, compost, earthworm castings, and perlite.
So if we're looking back at that budget and we're saying that, hey, a prefabricated metal raised bed is really not within my budget at this moment, that's quite all right, because there are alternatives that we can look into that will still cost us more time and effort, but will be lower on the money scale. So now when it comes to our raised bed, it's going to be within the same wheelhouse, kind of how I mentioned with your containers. You can build and fabricate and make your own. And honestly, again, the limitations are only going to be limited by your imagination. For instance, you can build it out of materials that are in your budget. So we're talking about dimensional lumber, we're talking about cinder blocks, or again, metal if you have access to it. This is where you're going to have to figure out what is feasible for you and also factor again time, effort, and money. And now, when it comes to dimensional lumber, a lot of people have asked in the past, hey, can I use pressure treated lumber? Yes, you can. The pressure treated lumber that's being treated nowadays is not the same pressure treated lumber from the days of past when we were talking about pressure treating processes that was using arsenic and other harsh chemicals. The process is a lot safer now. So you can actually use pressure treated lumber. But again, it is still a lumber, just like I was mentioning with the cedar. So eventually it will erode, not erode, it will decay over time. So if you have it in your budget to do a metal raised bed, honestly, it is going to save you a lot of that time and effort that we talked about once before. And now that's going to take me to my next point. Okay. When it comes to the different styles of gardening, again, you have to do what works best for you, because I'm going to tell you a secret. I use all three. I use traditional rows as well as container and raised beds as well. I have several raised beds, a plethora of containers, and I have my traditional rows. The only caveat I will say, if you choose to do traditional row gardening, and I should have put this at the beginning of the video in all earnest, one thing I'm going to highly recommend, and this comes from me being a Texas master gardener, is test your soil first. Contact your local ag extension. Whatever state you're in, if you're in the United States, whatever state you're in, contact your local ag extension at their website. All it takes is a Google search, and test your soil. Know your starting point first, because there'll be a plethora of people out there to tell you to add this or add that to your soil. You won't know what to truly add to your soil, if you need to even add anything to your soil at all. You have to test it first. And that's going to test for your nitrogen levels, your potassium, your phosphorus, all of your macro and micronutrients. It's going to test for your pH levels. It's going to test for all of those things. And if you're looking at me and you're saying, Gray, what are all these different macro and micronutrients you're talking about? Don't worry about it. Because guess what? In following videos, I will explain all of that when I start breaking down soil science to you. But if you're truly thinking about just sticking a seed in the ground, I would say that would be your best starting point, is to get a soil test first. It's really not that expensive. It give or take, depending on the state, but it's usually like somewhere in the vicinity of about $20 US. And test your soil and see what your starting point. And plus, you're supporting your local agriculture extension. They do so much work for you as the grower. They do so much research, and their websites. Now, for me, my local ag extension is going to be Texas A&M. Their website, there's a plethora of free science-based information that's out there. It's not a bunch of hype and speculation or gardening hacks, as there's all over the internet. This is true, real information that the botanists out at the local ag extension have found and researched for you, and it's available free. So definitely check out your local ag extension. I'm going to put the link down here for my local ag extension. Again, that's Texas A&M. So we've talked about a lot today. We haven't even discussed plants yet. Don't worry, that time is coming. In our follow-up episodes, I'll discuss with you how to find that ideal location for your garden, as well as what are the right starter plants for a beginner. I hope you found this information helpful, because that's my whole entire goal, is to become that source for you for information in regards to gardening, in regards to plants, and in regards to soil. It's been a pleasure chatting with you today. I'll talk to you again real soon.